Hong Kong's tourist attractions have been quiet recently. This is the result of protests that started in June 2019 and have lasted for almost 6 months now. The protest started with massive marches against the proposed extradition bill, which would allow extradition of fugitives to several jurisdictions, including mainland China. Since then, a variety of tactics have been employed by the protesters. Clashes with police intensified, and increasingly protesters have resorted to civil disobedience and radical actions, including roadblocks, occupation of universities, and vandalism, as the government would not yield to most of protesters' demands. The 5 demands of the protests are withdrawal of the bill, release of all arrested protesters, investigation into the alleged police brutality and misconduct, official retraction of characterization of protests as riots, and universal suffrage for Chief Executive and Legislative Council elections. In October, the bill has been withdrawn, but other 4 demands have not been addressed to the satisfaction of the protesters, and so the protests have continued. Various sectors of the economy have been hit by the protests, including tourism. Visitor numbers grew rapidly during the first half of 2019, following a record of 65 million visitors in 2018. However, that changed in July. The latest figures released by the Hong Kong Tourism Board show the negative growth in July 2019 of 4.8% compared to July 2018. In August, the negative growth was almost 40%, in September 34.5%, and in October minus 43.7%. From January to October 2019, the overall decline in visitation was 4.7% compared to the same period in 2018. What's even more worrying is that the decline in overnight visitors for the first 10 months of the year was 10%, while the same-day arrivals have been stagnant. Overnight visitors are better for the economy as they spend more widely, including on accommodation, while most of the spending of same-day visitors to Hong Kong only contributes to retail sector, and retail in Hong Kong is almost exclusively reliant on imported goods. It is unlikely that the number will recover soon, as November has seen more escalation in actions of both protesters and police, and over 40 jurisdictions worldwide issued travel warnings for Hong Kong. From August to October, many hotels saw their revenues slashed in half, and the occupancy rates dropped to about 50-60% instead of the usual 90%. Food and beverage, retail sector, aviation, transportation, all have been affected severely by the protests. And overall, the economy of Hong Kong has been shrinking. Most of the actions of protesters do not directly target tourists, although there have been some instances of harassment of mainland Chinese visitors. They are mostly affected by the protests that occur in and around tourist precincts. The most direct action that affected tourism were the sit-ins and clashes at the Hong Kong International Airport that took place on 9 to 13 of August. This resulted in cancellations of flights for several days, and now a new security arrangement is implemented whereby only passengers can enter the airport terminal. Most of the visitors to Hong Kong come from mainland China. In 2018, 78% of all visitors were from mainland. The protests have been strongly condemned by the mainland Chinese authorities and media, and that resulted in a steep decline of visitor arrivals from mainland China. For comparison, in the months between August and October, the mainland Chinese market has declined in between 35 to 45%, and long-haul markets declined on average between 20 to 25% in those same months. In October, the government spent about 100 million Hong Kong dollars on incentives for the travel sector. However, these incentives may not be sufficient nor sustainable if protests will last for long. Even if protests stop now, the recovery of visitor arrival numbers will not be swift. This is because most of the leisure market has already made plans for December and January, and the business travel is slow. So overnight arrivals may not be recovering as fast, but the same day arrivals from neighboring Guangdong cities can react to changing situations much faster. In the meantime, accommodation sector will focus on promotions for the staycation, for the local market. The same will be done for attractions, and aviation will focus on outbound and transit travelers. It may all look very gloomy at the moment, and it is uncertain how long the protest will last and what will be their outcome. But let's say government will compromise and protests will cease. There has been some concerns about the reputation of Hong Kong, but it certainly hasn't been destroyed. And most of its tourist assets, as well as world reputation, will remain. We have seen that many well-known and reputable destinations recover from various crises within 1 year. You can take the examples of Thailand, Japan, UK, Spain, France, that all have recovered from political turbulences, terrorism, or natural disasters. So it is also important to remember that the high growth of visitor arrival numbers were creating quite a lot of social tension in Hong Kong as well. And the rapid growth of tourism was not necessarily seen as a positive by the public. During the current slowdown, tourism businesses and policymakers could plan for the long term and shift their focus from visitor arrival growth to diversifying inbound markets, creating more diversified, memorable and transformational experiences for visitors, and focusing more on environmentally friendly practices as well as socially responsible practices, so that tourism provides a greater contribution to the well-being of Hong Kong residents.